welcome to 2019. I hope everyone had a great 2018. And now, kicking off the new year, I want to start with some new stuff. We had the podcast going. Now I did a little bit of YouTubing and I want to get back into that, do some more of that to provide some more video because I know not everybody listens to podcasts. So today I want to talk a little bit about implementation and how implementation matters. And if you listen to the podcast, I already talked about this on the podcast just a little bit, but not everybody listens to podcasts. So I like to put it out someplace else as well. And this is where I'm going to do that. So implementation, it matters. We talk about threat modeling. We talk about understanding our application and the threats that are there for our application, right? The things that put our application at risk and understanding where our application is, what type of environments it is in, where it sits. All this type of stuff goes into understanding the risk around our application. And the reason I brought this up, I saw an interesting news article come out just the other day, maybe a week or so ago now, since I podcasted Monday about it. Now we're doing this. So it was like last week, I think I saw this. And it kind of caught my eye because we talk about authentication all the time. And one of the coolest things I think there is about the security industry is that we do a really good job of thinking outside the box, thinking of different ways to break things that are built. And that may not be the best thing all the time, but for the most part, it helps make things better. So when we come up with some form of authentication, for example, we do facial recognition, and then somebody comes out and they say, hey, I can hold a picture up, and it tricks the facial recognition, and now I can access that system. Or we do Touch ID on the iPhone and the iPad. And then we find out maybe there's a way that we can, fake the fingerprint and be able to gain access. And while, yes, we're finding ways to bypass this, we're also helping increase the security in a way that we're saying, hey, there's ways to get around this. Maybe we didn't consider these things when we first built it, but now we can think about them. Let's improve our systems. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to improve our systems to make sure that they're the best that they can be. And so I thought about it and I'm thinking, wow, the implementation details are really what matters because, you look at all these different things. You look at Touch ID, you look at facial recognition. A lot of times, while we come up with bypasses for these, they may not be necessarily that easy to pull off. For example, with Touch ID, that's a little bit more tricky to be able to do because, right, that's sitting on my system. You have to have my device to be able to pull that off. So you have to have some sort of physical access. You have to get my fingerprint to be able to then perform that action. So the risks there change based on how this is set up. Versus when we think about passwords on an open system on the internet, right? I could be anywhere. The barrier to complete that task is very low because anybody on the internet can reach that website and they can try inputting passwords, right? So if I can find that password, it's much easier for me to gain access. Not so much when we talk about some of these biometric pieces where you have to have that fingerprint or you have to have that facial recognition. A lot of times those are limited more to physical devices and not logging in directly to applications yet. We'll start to see that a little bit more. We definitely see it with Touch ID, being able to log into your applications and everything using Touch ID or facial recognition. We can do that, but it's not necessarily something that somebody across the world can easily just spoof, right? Makes it a little bit more difficult because of that limited access. So the story I saw, which I thought was really kind of interesting, happened to be about hackers use fake wax hand to fool vain authentication security. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen a place where they use vein authentication. If you have, let us know. Share your stories with us because I'd be interested to know where you see that type of thing because it's interesting. You don't see vein very much. You typically see the facial recognition, the fingerprints. So here we have somebody has figured out a way to be able to create this wax hand, apparently using a photo taking of somebody's hand, being able to create this hand that can trick the vein authentication. So that's interesting. I don't know, how susceptible most places are that use the vein authentication for this, But it's interesting because this is going to be something that's going to help us make this authentication mechanism better, right? Because now we've found a way to be able to, hey, look, we can spoof this somehow. Maybe there's something additional we need to do to be able to make sure that the hand that's placed there is a real hand versus a fake hand. Now, I don't know how they would do that, but that's something that may be looked into in how they can increase and improve their scanners. So while this came out, there was a story, I'll put a reference out to this, but it was out on The Verge talking about this, and some researchers did a presentation at a conference talking about this, and they had it talking about it took over 200 images, I think, to finally get the right photograph they needed, and then some general consumer tech to be able to build this fake hand to be able to actually bypass the authentication. And of course, there's other things that go into this. I think they had a little bit of trouble during their demo. Everybody that's done live demos, you pray to the demo gods that everything works right, because usually they don't. But due to, I think, some lighting issues and maybe some other things, yeah, maybe it didn't go as planned, but they got their point across of what actually was possible here. But again, this got me back to thinking about, okay, implementation, though. And the reason I thought about the implementation was I happened to have to go to the doctor's the other day to have an x-ray done. And when I went to the doctor's office, sure enough, they've got a palm reader on there that you place your hand on. It reads your veins, the layout, whatnot, to determine if you are who they have on the system and record. And of course, they asked me, hey, have you used this reader before? And I was like, I have, but I'm not sure if it was here. So let's give it a try. And sure enough, it worked. But if you think about the implementation in that case, okay, they use the vein authentication, and we've got this bypass. But I'm standing at a reception desk, or the front desk, I guess, if you will, of this hospital where there's 3 people sitting there, and the authentication piece is up on top of the desk where everybody can see me. Now, if you click the link to the article, you'll see the giant fake hand that they have here that they've created, or I'm assuming it's the picture of the hand. I'm not sure where they got the picture from. But I think somebody might notice if I put a fake hand up there. That's just me, because somebody's attended, right? This is an attended authentication, right? They come over, they squirt some stuff to sanitize it or something. I'm not sure what they're doing. They watch you place your hand on it. They're checking to make sure everything validates out. Right, they're doing a lot of stuff. And for all I know, when it does that, it may pop a picture of me as well. I'm not sure. I didn't see the computer screen, but that may be possible. So in that type of scenario, it may be very difficult, not only getting the right image of that person's hand and creating the item, but then to actually execute it might be very difficult in that scenario. Versus if you look at if they had this type of authentication, maybe on the outside of a door, maybe to get into some sort of facility, a government building, something like that. If they're just using that vein authentication, maybe they've got cameras around, but they might not have somebody that's actually there. It might be sort of an unattended authentication system where, maybe people wouldn't notice that you've put that fake hand on there to bypass the system. So when we look at that and we think about the implementation of how these things work, right, that implementation actually makes a big difference. Is it an attended situation? Is it unattended? And take that out to our applications. When we think about things like authentication and login, we think about the controls that we have around login, right? We'll do account lockouts. We do other brute force protections that we may implement. Maybe you don't want to do account lockout. I've seen some systems that will actually implement a CAPTCHA on the login screen rather than an account lockout. Okay, well, what happens if you log in via an API and you don't log in through your normal post request? That's not to the API, but it's just the application resubmitting itself. Well, the API, because it's oftentimes there's no user interface, may be more difficult to implement a CAPTCHA situation. So maybe that's not as important as doing something like the lockout capability, or implementing rate limiting, or something like that, right? Those throttling techniques to be able to stop brute force attacks, because we don't have a UI. But when we have a UI, we have other techniques that we could use to get around this. So I thought this was a great story to see, because like I said, I enjoy reading articles like this because the ingenuity that comes out of what people are doing and what they think of and how can I bypass this and being able to put something together to do it is pretty cool. It's pretty cool to build stuff like that. And, it makes you feel good when you actually get that win, that bypass that you've found. That's a good feeling, and again, like I said, this helps make stuff more secure if we can actually fix it. The thing is, we need to also make sure that we're looking at it and saying, okay, well, let's understand our implementation. So if you're a place that uses vein authentication and you see this story and you think, oh man, vein authentication bypass, this is a bad thing. Maybe not in your implementation. Maybe it's much more difficult to pull this off in your implementation versus some other implementation. And, I think about this when I think about, you see a lot of these vulnerabilities that pop out there. Somebody, a MongoDB was sitting out there with no password, sitting out exposed on the internet, and now everybody thinks, oh no, all MongoDB databases are vulnerable. Well, that's not the case. Maybe yours isn't sitting out on the internet. Maybe it's tucked away on a secure network behind the firewalls that only your application can get to, right? So we have to understand when we see these things, yes, I need to understand it, but I also need to be able to take a step back and understand how does that affect my implementation and my security within my applications and my network to know, hey, am I at risk here or am I at greater risk? Or does this really not affect me? And there's tons of examples we could come up with out there, but I'm not going to put a whole bunch out there. I think you got the idea, but it would be interesting if you have ideas to share them. Put them in the comments. Shoot them out to me, james@developsec.com, or out on Twitter @developsec. Share your thoughts on this because I think it's an interesting thing. It's neat to find stuff that's like this. It reminds me especially stuff like DEF CON, where you're seeing kind of wow, that's really cool, but how could I implement that? How drastic could that really be? Wow, that could be bad, but the barrier is really high, but it's really cool. And it's really interesting to see this stuff and learn about it and understand. And that helps us think about when we're designing our apps. It's one more thing we're going to think about when we determine, hey, we're going to do authentication. What steps are we going to use? What factors are we going to use? Because of the factors that we're using, what type of risks does that open us up to? What type of risks does that help mitigate? And how can we make sure that we're at the level of security that we need to be at to protect the assets, our customers, our data, all that information? So hopefully that was interesting for you. I thought it was interesting. Let me know what you think. And, I'm looking to do more of this year. I got a whole bunch of ideas that we've already got lined up. I think my idea is kind of to, put everything together where during the week I'm going to do the podcast. I'm going to do this type of video about this, maybe the write-up about it, kind of a topic during that week, and kind of cover it on all the different mediums. So let me know what you think. If you have questions or anything, don't hesitate. Reach out. Let me know. Happy to talk about any of this stuff, application security. It's what I like talking about. So thanks for tuning in, and look for the next video coming out